I once worked with a couple who looked completely fine and normal on the outside. What do I mean by that? Well, they weren't yelling. They weren't throwing things at each other when they'd get mad. They weren't even having, the telltale classic signs of big blowout arguments. But there was just, I guess the best way to say it would be like this tangible energy between them that was heavy. And you could tell that there were a lot of things that were causing pain for them, but weren't being talked about. Why? Well, as I got to know them, it became obvious that every conversation was laced with these little jabs, verbal jabs at each other. So, for example, she would say something to him like, "Oh, sure, you're Mr. Perfect." And he would say things like, "Ah, you're late again. Well, at least you try." And he might say, "Well, if you didn't nag me so much, maybe I'd actually wanna come home." And it was this back and forth sparring constantly. And when I asked them about it, they both said the same thing. "We're just joking with each other. We're just being sarcastic." Well, what they didn't realize is that every one of those jokes, those so-called jokes, was cutting them. Each one of those sarcastic remarks stung. They were like little word darts getting under each other's skin. And on the surface, it might have seemed like they were joking, but what they were really doing was weaponizing their words. Welcome back to the High Ticket Woman. I'm really glad you're here with me today because I want to talk to you about this. I want to talk to you about sarcasm, jokes, and criticism. Sometimes the things that that we think are playful and lighthearted, but are really actually quite destructive in the way that they show up in marriage. So we're going to explore some of these sort of passive aggressive words that we can use that will just slowly erode trust, and how saying the words just kidding doesn't erase the damage, does it? So what we're really talking about here is learning to speak with spiritual maturity. Why do weaponized words hurt so much? I mean, this might seem like an obvious answer, but let's look to the Bible. Proverbs 18:1 says, "The tongue has the power of life and death." So that's a pretty big, bold statement, right? The tongue has the power of life and death. That means that every word you speak is either planting life or sowing death into your marriage. Have you ever stopped and thought about it that way? Weaponized words, sarcasm, cutting jokes, constant criticism, they hurt because they send hidden messages. Sarcasm says, "I can't be honest with you, so I'm going to disguise my truth, the way I really feel, it in thinly veiled humor." Cutting jokes say, I wanna hurt you, but I'm gonna do it in a way that gives me cover." And criticism says, "I see your flaws more clearly than I see your value." And again, over time, those words really destroy intimacy. Trust doesn't usually break in one big giant fight. No, it's death by a thousand cuts, isn't it? Let's look at some examples of each of these here. What does this actually look like in a marriage? Well, let's start with sarcasm and public jokes. I've heard it said that sarcasm is often called the lowest form of wit or humor. I agree. I think there's a good reason for that because on the surface, it looks like humor, but underneath, if you really think about it, it's usually anger, frustration, or criticism just wearing a mask. Okay. Because the person using the sarcasm gets to say something hurtful but hide behind the words, "I'm just kidding. Can't you take a joke? Don't take yourself so seriously." But the one on the receiving end of that doesn't feel that humor. You know that to be true. I know that to be true. We've all been on the receiving end of sarcasm, haven't we? No, it feels like, it feels like a bit of a sting. So if your spouse is doing this to you, or you're doing it to your spouse, the person on the receiving end never knows if the words are safe or if there's some sort of hidden jab or hidden meaning underneath the words. And it's not just sarcasm in private, right? Many couples get into the habit of making fun of each other in public, which is every time I see this, I just cringe internally. I just think, "Oh, your marriage is going to pay such a stiff price for this." Maybe it's at a dinner party, maybe it's at church, maybe it's even on social media. So the spouse on the receiving end may often laugh along to save face, but inside they might be thinking, if you really respected me, if you really loved me, you wouldn't make me the punchline. Public jokes at your spouse's expense are especially damaging because they humiliate rather than showing honor. And sometimes this is the way I see this play out. Sometimes it's not your spouse that has told the joke. Sometimes somebody else has said something quote unquote funny at your expense, but your spouse laughs along. And that can be just as hurtful, just as damaging. Because in that moment, what do you really want your spouse to do? You want them to defend you. You want them to say, "That's not true. My wife is my husband does," and to defend your honor. So when your spouse even laughs along with somebody else's public joke at your expense, again, damage is done. Your marriage becomes the stage for cheap laughs, and intimacy is traded for entertainment. You know, Ephesians 5:33 tells us to respect our spouse, but you can't have respect and ridicule living under the same roof. It just doesn't work that way. So when you say, for example, to your husband, "Thanks for helping with the kids tonight," and your husband says something like, "Well, mark the calendar. I actually did something right." Okay, ha ha ha. But again, what's the hidden meaning behind that? Or I've certainly been on the receiving end of this. How many women have? Your husband says to you at a dinner party, or yeah, sorry, yeah, says to you at a dinner party. I mean, I'm getting my examples mixed up here. Um, well, says it to everybody else while you're sitting there. "She's the boss. I just do what she says." Right? I hear that comment a lot. I certainly been on the receiving end of that comment. Not with Jeff, but with my previous husband. And you might laugh along, but I d I felt kind of humiliated. What about you? Criticism. Instead of being honest and saying, "I felt hurt when you said this," instead you might say something like, "You always put me down in front of people. You never say anything kind about me." Okay, criticism. What you really wanna say is, "Ouch, those words hurt." So each one of these things, sarcasm, public jokes, and criticism, or do I say criticism? Sarcasm, that's what I meant. Each of these creates distance. Even if you're delivering them with a smile, the smile does not take away the sting. All right? So, a sarcastic remark or a put down, it might feel small in the moment, but if it's repeated often, day after day, again, that's what erodes trust. So why do we do this? Why do we use weaponized words? Well, it's a really common thing, unfortunately. It's easy to slip into this pattern. I think one of the reasons is, again, avoidance. Sarcasm can often feel safer than honesty. So instead of saying, "I feel hurt for whatever reason," you make some kind of sarcastic remark, right? It's a way of expressing pain without risking the vulnerability of being direct. The problem, of course, is that avoidance might protect you in the moment from that potential conflict. You don't want to fight about it, so you make some sort of sarcastic remark. But what that's doing is it's guaranteeing long-term disconnection because your spouse doesn't hear the actual pain that you're feeling, the hurt, the disappointment. Your spouse is only responding to the job. Another reason I think why we do this is resentment. Unspoken frustrations, they don't just disappear, do they? No, they leak out into our words. So when you've been disappointed over and over, when those small disappointments in your marriage begin to pile up, they come out in that biting humor, in those critical remarks, disguised as humor. So you can even be self-deprecating. You can say things like, "Well, nobody ever listens to me anyway." And of course, the implication is my spouse doesn't listen to me. But even though you're laughing when you say it, what are you really doing? You're complaining. You're launching a protest of not being heard. Okay. So when we weaponize our words, it can be easier to wound than to admit, I'm feeling neglected. I'm feeling not heard. I'm feeling not listened to. Immaturity is another reason why we weaponize words. Sometimes we've just never learned healthy ways to handle strong emotions. Maybe we grew up in families where sarcasm was the norm or where jokes are the only acceptable outlet for anger. And without the maturity that's needed, we don't know how to recognize what we're doing. So we default to these patterns of behavior and we dodge the responsibility that good, effective communication requires behind the guise of humor. And this is why we say things like, "Don't take it so seriously. Can't you take a joke?" Right? But that's not, that's a one-upmanship kind of thing, right? When we say that to our spouse, we're looking down on them. Like, "What's wrong with you? I'm just telling a joke. Grow up." But that's not us being mature. That's emotional laziness on our part because our spouse ends up having to carry the hurt of what we said. Another reason would be a power play. Sometimes we use words as weapons just to maintain control in the relationship. So we can use public jokes at our spouse's expense or constant sarcasm or repeated criticism, all to serve a hidden purpose to keep our spouse feeling smaller or on the defensive. Again, it's that one upmanship, right? Uh, Again, the tragedy of this is that every power playing marriage is really a loss for both of us. The husband, the wife, you might win in the moment, but you weaken the foundation of trust that your marriage requires. It might win you a laugh from the people around you, but you lose again that long term connection. So, how do you break the pattern? Well, first of all, you have to call it for what it is. Stop justifying it. Stop justifying sarcasm or hurtful jokes. If it's hurtful, it's hurtful. If you don't like being on the receiving end of it, stop doing it. Admit when it hurts. If your spouse is doing it to you, don't just laugh along. Turn to your spouse. I don't care who's sitting there. Turn to your spouse and say, "Ouch." Call them out on it and then privately discuss it. Let them know this isn't okay. I don't like being talked to this way. And if you're the one doing it and your spouse is calling you out, acknowledge that that's what's happening. Then speak directly. Say what you really mean. I felt hurt when. I need help with. Or I need this to stop. Or I need this to start happening. Replace criticism with curiosity. I say this one a lot, don't I? Can you help me understand why this happened? Can you help me understand why you thought that was funny? Can you help me know what was going on inside of your head when you did this or when you said that? Instead of, you always do this or you always do that. You always mess up. You never listen. That's going to ensure an argument. But if you invite clarification from your spouse by asking those curious questions, help me understand what's going on in your head. Help me to know where you're coming from. All of those invite curiosity. Agree on some boundaries, or we could call them guardrails. Some couples have a rule. We don't make fun of each other in public. We don't do that. We don't put each other down. We don't use each other as a source of humor. Just agree with your spouse. Let's not do this. In my first marriage, we had a rule that we would never say shut up to each other. Now, this is a little bit different of an example, but that was a rule that we established from the very beginning of our marriage, and we never, ever used that word, ever. Not in public, not in private, and I still don't with my marriage with Java. I never, and he doesn't either. Neither of us ever says to each other, "Shut up." Not even, quote, unquote, in humor, in jest. So, you can have those rules, you can have those boundaries established in your marriage, but you do need to speak out about it. And then, of course, last but definitely not least, pray for discernment. Ask God to set a guard over your mouth. If this is something that you struggle with, if you tend to be a pretty sarcastic person, ask God to help you use your words to be a blessing to your spouse, not a source of hurt. I really want you to ask yourself some important questions. Do I use sarcasm or jokes as a cover for what I'm really feeling, my real frustrations, my real hurts, the things that I don't know how to say out loud? How safe does my spouse feel with my words? If you're lacking emotional safety in your marriage, this may be a place for you to really pay attention to. Because if you are having fun at your spouse's expense, chances are your spouse has stopped opening up to you about what's really going on inside of them, or vice versa. And third question I really want you to think about is, would I speak the same way to my spouse if Christ was physically sitting right here next to us? You know, there used to be this catchphrase, you'd even see it on bumper stickers, what would Jesus do? It's not a bad question to ask yourself. If Christ was right there, right next to you, would you talk the same way to your spouse as you do right now? Maybe you're realizing as we go through this and we come to a close, maybe you're realizing that your words or your spouses have really created some serious wounds in your marriage. Well, I want you to know this is exactly why I designed Marriage in Bloom. I see too much of this already in marriages, and I just want to help people change it. Honestly, that is why I do what I do. And I realized in creating Marriage in Bloom that this isn't a quick, easy thing to turn around. So that's why I made it a 6-month intensive recovery program, because that is the period of time that where we can really begin to walk through patterns that destroy safety and trust, and begin to rebuild them with honesty and grace and connection. And sometimes those weaponizing words are a big part of what's going on. And sometimes we lash out because we've been hurt, so we're trying to jab back at our spouse. But again, it's so crazy, crazy damaging. So whether you're coming in as a couple, or maybe your spouse isn't ready to do this with you right now, if you're starting solo, you don't have to stay in the same cycle. You can learn how to communicate more effectively, more honestly. Just reach out to me, debbiecaudle.com. Words can be weaponizing for sure, but they can also be medicine to the soul. The choice is the choice is ours. When we use sarcasm and criticism, cutting jokes, again, we may win the moment, but we lose in the end. So I want you to really think about that. Do you want honesty and gentleness and grace and safety in your marriage? Because safety is where intimacy grows. You can't have it any other way. That's it for today, everybody. Thanks for joining me on the High Ticket Woman. I'm glad you're here as always. Please share this if you know somebody that would really benefit from this. Pass this episode along. Please subscribe. That helps me out a lot. Subscribe, and that way you know when future episodes are coming. And leave me a comment. Tell me what you think, good, bad, or ugly. Tell me what you want to hear more of. All comments are welcome. And I appreciate when people make the effort. Remember, as I always say, you don't have to be perfect. Your marriage doesn't have to be perfect. It's not attainable anyway. But what does need to happen in order for you to have the marriage you want is that you have to stay teachable. I'll see you next week.